Hello, horse racing fans, and welcome to the final layer of the Kentucky Derby Iceberg. It's been a long journey to get to this point. Depending on when this gets released, it's taken me around a year to finish this mammoth, but we're finally here, at the very bottom. These are the completely forgotten winners of the Kentucky Derby. What kind of stories do these old champions have? We're about to find out. For the last time, this is the Kentucky Derby Iceberg.
As the field turns for home in the Kentucky Derby!
Baden Baden. The Derby has had many celebrities and powerful figures in attendance, and this tradition goes all the way back to its third iteration, when Polish Shakespearean actress Halma Majewska watched the 1877 Run for the Roses. She would watch favorite Leonard set the early fractions and get run down by a dark chestnut horse named Baden Baden, trained and ridden by former slaves Edward Brown and William Walker. Brown, known as Brown Dick, in reference to a champion racehorse of the era and his own speed in foot races, started his journey as a jockey riding the unbeaten Asteroid, one of the best pre-Civil War horses, and then Kingfisher in the 1870 Belmont Stakes. When his weight proved too much, he became a trainer. He never had the capital to compete with the millionaires of racing, but was able to become one of the richest African Americans by the turn of the century, mainly by buying horses, training them to win as juveniles, and selling them for higher prices. He trained and sold 3 future Derby winners: Hindu, Benbrush, and Plaudit. Baden Baden was sold after his Derby win for $12,500 and became the first Derby winner to also win the Travers Stakes, but that was where his success ended. 4 wins from 10 starts and a forgettable stud career. His jockey that day, William Walker, guided him to victory at just 17 years of age. His other big success was winning the famous match race between Ten Broeck and Molly McCarthy, which inspired its own song. Despite being shut out of being a jockey in the 1890s, he still found jobs as a training assistant and pedigree expert. His skills being so highly praised, he remained active and successful in racing during a time where black people were being pushed out of it. One of the later horses he had a hand in starting the career of was a grumpy chestnut who went on to become America's first Triple Crown winner, Sir Barton. Daystar. Possibly the first Kentucky Derby winner ever photographed, Daystar had a long career, but it was one that was forgettable, besides his win in the 1878 Kentucky Derby. Himyar was the heavy favorite, with Daystar being a distant second choice. But with no starting gates in those days, it was a walk-up start, and after 4 false starts, the race was off, with Himyar breaking terribly, 10 lengths back. Daystar, on the other hand, had the lead and never lost it, as he set a new record for 1.5 miles under jockey Jimmy Carter, 99 years before the more well-known Jimmy Carter became president. He also did once have partial ownership and an alumni of the Preakness Stakes. Daystar raced until he was 7 years old, with modest success, winning 11 times from 42 races, later becoming a steeplechaser, jumping over fences, a unique route for a Derby winner. Remarkably, something like this has occurred in more recent history, when Mr. Hot Stuff ran 15th in the 2009 Kentucky Derby, and later in life won 2 Grade 1 steeplechases. Lord Murphy. When Tennessee and horses are put together, it's usually in reference to the beloved Tennessee walking horse, known for their smooth gait rather than their speed. Tennessee's most famous person, Elvis Presley, owned a couple of these in his time, but in the 1800s, many great thoroughbreds also came from the state. And the first horse not bred in Kentucky to take the Kentucky Derby was a Tennessee bred, Lord Murphy. Originally named Patmos, he was sold for $400 and given a new name. The 4th Derby was an interstate battle. For Tennessee, the favorite Lord Murphy; for Kentucky, Falsetto; and the filly, Wissahickon, the full sister to the first Derby winner Aristides. The big drama of the race occurred on the first turn, when Ada Glenn collided with Lord Murphy and nearly fell to his knees. This would have stopped most, but Lord Murphy recovered, and with half a mile to go, he had the lead. Falsetto, with the great Isaac Murphy aboard, got on even terms, leading to a first of many thrilling Derby finishes, but in the final 40 yards, Lord Murphy pulled ahead, to win the day in a record time of 2 minutes and 37 seconds. A record that lasted 7 years. Following this win, Lord Murphy took Churchill Downs' St. Leger Stakes, a no longer existing race, and was sold for an unsuccessful campaign in England. he retired with 6 wins from 14 starts, with no success at stud, while his rival Falsetto sired 3 Derby winners, getting his revenge off the track. Fonso, Eat My Dust. A classic piece of trash talk you could use in a race. It was perfectly appropriate for the 1880 Kentucky Derby. The track that day was extremely dusty, and Fonso was the culprit, being the frontrunner the whole way around. The dust got so thick, it was 5 inches deep, and the back runners were totally obscured. The race had quickly divulged into a match race between Fonso and the favorite Kimball, but Fonso led every step of the way. Kimball ran valiantly in a performance that was described as a winning one. However, Fonso was too much, and won by a length. After the race, the jockey on Kimball, Billy Lakeland, filed a claim of foul to try and get Fonso disqualified. It was the first steward's inquiry in Kentucky Derby history. The claim was disallowed, and Fonso stayed the winner, with young 18-year-old jockey George Lewis aboard. Tragically, George died only a month later after falling off his horse in a race in St. Louis. An awful end to a career that seemed to be only just starting. As for Fonso, he retired only a start later with 5 wins from 12 starts and earnings of $8,175, the second lowest from a Derby winner in history. Despite paltry earnings, he had beaten one future champion during his career, when he outran Luke Blackburn in the Phoenix Stakes. Luke was a legendary Tennessee bred that after his initial loss to Fonso, won 22 of his next 23 starts at age 3. Fonso passed away around the turn of the century, with his lasting impact as a sire being through his daughter Fondling, who then gave birth to one of the best fillies of the 19th century, the legendary black mare Imp, a winner of 62 races. Buchanan. The rider can make all the difference. There was no clear favorite before Kentucky Derby number 10. Buchanan certainly wasn't going to take the role. In 6 starts, he had never won a race. Although he wasn't without talent, he had finished second in 5 of them and third in the other. He just had a problem. His temper. Described by his jockey as the wildest horse in America. That jockey just so happened to be one of the greatest to ever sit on a horse's back. Isaac Murphy. A jockey so good that by the end of his career, he had a winning percentage of 34.5%. Today, the greatest jockey struggled to win 20%. His first of 3 Derby wins was on the horse he would have never picked. Buchanan had previously gotten disqualified from his 6th second-place finish due to his antics during a race. Murphy was under contract to ride this noble beast, so reluctantly, he rode the winless horse. William Byrd was the trainer. He had also coached Kimball, the runner-up in the 1880 Derby, and Crickmore, who twice beat the 1881 Derby winner Hindu, even snapping his 18-race win streak. Neither Isaac or Byrd had won the Derby, and with this rowdy steed, things were going to be different. Buchanan wore blinkers for the first time. It didn't work perfectly. He proved difficult in the post-parade and started poorly, but when the race was underway, luck began to change. Murphy held him on the inside for the first half, and then moved to the outside, where he was let loose. Circling the field and running away much the best, Isaac eased the horse up to win convincingly. After that day, Isaac and Byrd were champions, and Buchanan was no longer a silver medalist. Days later, Isaac pulled a historic double to take the Kentucky Oaks on modesty, and finally, he became the only jockey to win Churchill Downs' 3 oldest major races when he got back on Buchanan to win the Clark Handicap. It took 140 years for another jockey to match this, when Brian Hernandez Jr. rode Torpedo Anna, Mystic Dan, and Rattle and Roll to win the 150th Kentucky Derby, Oaks, and Clark Stakes. As for Buchanan, in 35 starts, he won 8, along with a remarkable 14 seconds and 10 thirds. Only 3 times did he not make it into the top 3 over 3 years of racing. For all the trouble he may have caused, he'll always be an important horse in the story of America's best jockey. And to think, he didn't want to ride this horse. Riley. Originally named Short Fellow, as a young horse, when it was time for him to race, he was given a new name of Riley, named after Clinton C. Riley, a rider for the DRF. It was a miserable day in Louisville, and the first time the race would be rated as muddy. Good news for Riley, he loved the mud, and was leaps and bounds ahead of the rest of the field. In no particular hurry, he completed the Kentucky Derby in 2 minutes and 45 seconds under Isaac Murphy. It was his biggest win in a long career, full of ups and downs, which included being mistakenly thought to have died in a train crash, winning from as east as New York and Jersey to the west of Kentucky and Tennessee, and trying and failing to become a steeplechaser. By the end of this long career, he had won 30 times from 64 outs, and was taken care of into his retirement by a horse rescue operation, one of the first Derby horses to receive accredited aftercare in his old age. His owner, Ed Corrigan, was known to beat up anyone he didn't like, even once thinking that he had beaten someone to death, but after splashing water on them and realizing they were okay, went back to beating them up. One of the few people he did not assault was the great Isaac Murphy. While a second Derby win was a welcome introduction to the new decade, the 1890s proved tumultuous for Murphy. In June of 1890, he won a high-profile match race against the best white jockey, George Snapper Garrison, on a horse named Salvatore, by a nose over Garrison's Mount Tenney. But then 2 months later, Isaac rode poorly on a champion horse named Ferenzi, and collapsed after the race. He was accused of riding drunk, an accusation that he staunchly denied, instead claiming he was poisoned and hadn't eaten for 2 days to keep weight. Despite drinking before racing being something other jockeys actually did, due to his race, this accusation was enough to ruin his once lauded reputation as one of the most honest riders, and started the end of his career. But it wasn't all over for him. Only 10 days after Riley had won the Kentucky Derby, he would finish second in the Latonia Derby. But only a race prior, a 2-year-old horse had crossed the wire first, and this horse would become Isaac's next Derby ticket. Kingman. Secretariat is known as the fastest winner of the Kentucky Derby. Now I present to you the slowest. A field of 4 horses lined up, with Kingman the favorite, but each jockey had the exact same instructions, to hold their horses back for the first mile. So when the race began and no one set the pace, it turned into a competition of who could go the slowest, each jockey wondering who was going to set the pace. When one horse inched forward, the jockey immediately pulled them back. They were so slow. They ran the mile in 2 minutes and 1 second, almost 2 seconds slower than Secretariat's time for a mile and a quarter. But finally, Isaac Murphy, down from the previous year but not out, let the horse run. He gained the edge over his fellow plotters and won by half a length, stopping the clock in an atrocious 2 minutes 52 and a quarter seconds, over 7 seconds slower than the second slowest Derby time done by Riley. It was considered a farce, in contention for the worst Kentucky Derby ever, smack dab in the middle of the Derby's darkest period, between the Ben Ollie betting scandal of 1886 and Matt Winn taking over in 1902. While he is the slowest Derby winner, Kingman was far from a bad racehorse. The Tennessee bred had won the Phoenix Stakes in a start prior in record time, and in a workout, he had worked the Kentucky Derby distance in 2 minutes 35 and a half seconds, only a second slower than the fastest Derby at the time by Spokane. After the Derby, he made a double by taking the Latonia Derby. He was retired at the end of his 3-year-old year, and sadly passed away at just 5 years old. For the people surrounding the horse, it was a historical win with merit. Isaac Murphy became the first jockey to write 3 Derby winners. It took 39 years to tie that mark with Earl Sandy, and 57 to surpass by Eddie Arcaro. Kingman was also the only Derby winner co-owned by a black man, in Dudley Allen, who also trained the horse. It was the last time an African-American trainer won the Kentucky Derby. After this hat trick, Isaac's career continued to slow, until he retired in 1895. Still, the last race he rode was a winning one. He tried to switch to training, but sadly he passed away in 1896 at just 35 years old from pneumonia, a common side effect for jockeys in those days due to how light they weighed. The crash diets needed to stay 100 to 110 pounds caused a very weakened immune system. He was the first jockey inducted into racing's Hall of Fame. Even today, there are things that he has done that no jockey will ever replicate, and while it has taken longer than it should have, he is finally getting the name recognition that he deserves as the Prince of Jockeys. Joe Cotton. Twice upon a time, a man placed a large bet on a chestnut racehorse. The first time, it was a man named Joe Cotton, a New York bookmaker, and he placed it on a horse named after him. But Equine Joe Cotton wasn't just sentimental. He was a good horse, riding a 3-race win streak that year. There was money, but also pride on the line for Joe Cotton as he bet on Joe Cotton. As the field departed from the starting line, the horse stumbled and started 7th of 10 horses. Fast fractions were run up front, but 17-year-old jockey Erskine Henderson was patient and saved Joe's burst for the end. With a quarter-mile left to go, he was asked for everything, and he got it. But it wasn't clean. Joe bobbled in the stretch, and on the outside, Bersan flew to try and run him down. And at the wire, it was Joe Cotton by a neck. For trainer Abraham Perry and jockey Erskine Henderson, his human inspiration was a richer man, but also had more gray hairs. 2 years later, a older, more battered Joe Cotton ran against one mare named Binette in the Average Stakes under new ownership by the New York elite Dwyer brothers. Mike Dwyer decided to make a bet on his heavy favorite, asking 2 commissioners to bet $3,000 each. But there was a miscommunication. They thought that he wanted $3,000 in winnings from these bets. And to do that, with the horse being at odds of 1 to 6, they both had to bet $20,000 each, which is what they did. Some sources even say they bet as much as $60,000. Even if we lowball it at just $40,000, that's $1.3 million in today's money. And jockey Jimmy McLaughlin, who would ride Joe Cotton, was told of the huge bet. Certainly there was no pressure. What was supposed to be a slam dunk turned into a fierce race as Binette went for broke and opened up 12 lengths on the backstretch, forcing Joe Cotton to run her down while carrying 25 more pounds. Every stride, he got closer, but the gap was nearly insurmountable. Jimmy never rode a race harder as they flew, and at the wire, with only 1 stride left, Joe mustered his strength once more and barely won, while also setting a track record for 1 mile and 3/16. Mike Dwyer nearly collapsed from the pressure of the race, and likely shaved 5 years off his life in 2 minutes, while Jimmy was so exhausted he had to be helped off the horse. Following this, Joe Cotton continued to decline in quality, facing injury and becoming a bleeder, until he fell in a race in Boston. At the time, he was reported dead, with a broken shoulder, but he actually lived. Rehabbed through swimming, he lived for an unclear amount of years, passing between the ages of 15 to 23, used as a crossbred sire and a hack horse. A mysterious but slightly uplifting ending to a horse who knew how to provide a thrill. Look out! In 1893, a flashy chestnut horse, with 3 white legs that went up to his knees, led the Kentucky Derby field, and won easily by 5 lengths. That was his greatest win, and his life before and after is mysterious. Some claimed he was bred by the Scogan brothers. Others believed it was Robert McClellan. As a 2-year-old, he was dominant, winning 9 of 20 races including the Minneapolis Stakes. Following his easy win in the Derby, he continued to race, being gelded at age 4 and running until he was 6 or 7 years old, with 17 wins from 66 outs, not just on flat, but also over steeplechases in Canada. How his life ended is unclear. Most don't paint him as living past 7 years. Some said he died in a steeplechase. Another story claimed that at the age of 8, he was sold for $65 to L. Reinhardt Jr., with his whereabouts afterward unknown. When the DRF published an article on the lives of every Derby winner in 1910, his paragraph was brief, and he was written to have been, quote, long gone, adding to the mystery of how the life of this bright-colored horse concluded. Montrose. Every owner should believe their horse can win, but how confident can you be? How about betting over $2,000 on your horse, who is the second highest price entry in the field, at 10 to 1? Even so, the field in general is considered far from the best. Jim Gore was the favorite, but after a half a mile, he was finished. Under 17-year-old Isaac Lewis, Montrose was guided to the lead. Isaac had been riding since he was 11 years old, guided by another successful African-American horseman in trainer Byron McClelland, the trainer of Hall of Fame stallion Henry of Navarre. While some were disappointed that Montrose won the race because he was a long shot, his connections laughed all the way to the bank, cashing $20,000 on top of the Derby's $4,200 winner's purse. Despite not being considered the best Derby winner, Montrose never seemed too far away from another success. In all 4 of his seasons on the track, he was able to win a stakes race, an above-average level of quality for any racehorse. 14 wins from 51 outs. He wasn't a successful stud, and died at 14. Isaac would go on to work at the very brief Harlem Park in Kentucky before it closed due to a gambling ban. His last reports were working at a Turkish bath. Macbeth II. The stereotype of a Kentucky Derby winner is a stallion that doesn't race for a very long time after winning. But Macbeth II was the complete opposite, being the 3rd and last gelding to win the Kentucky Derby in the 19th century. Being a gelding, there was no Lady Macbeth guiding him towards murdering King Duncan. Instead, it was a 17-year-old jockey named George Covington, who would guide him from the back of the pack all the way to the front to spring an upset as the 5th choice in the 1888 Kentucky Derby. He may have had his magnum opus at 3 years old, but Macbeth II was far from done. He would have the 2nd longest career of any Kentucky Derby winner, a remarkable 106 starts with 25 wins. Although by the end of his career he was a cheap claimer, but described as kind-hearted, the perfect horse for a young jockey or exercise rider to learn on. It was an unexceptional end to his racing career, although he still had some permanent damage from it, as he had all the nerves in one of his feet removed during his career. Despite this, he lived a long life post-racing. How long isn't clear, but in his final years he was seen being a saddle horse in Lincoln Park. A peaceful end to Macbeth II, in sharp contrast to his namesake. Halma. Byron McClellan didn't just teach a jockey how to win the Kentucky Derby. He trained his own horse to do it too. It was also the first Derby under the Twin Spires. The original Churchill Downs didn't have the iconic structure, but when it was time for a new grandstand to be made, a draftsman named Joseph Valdez had an idea. He wanted to add something special, something striking, to give the otherwise ordinary grandstand a cherry on top. His inspiration speculated to be the Louisville Trust Building across the street from the DX Murphy office where he worked. It worked better than anyone could have imagined. When you mention these structures, everyone knows what you're talking about. The 1895 Derby was both the first of a new era and the last of an old one. This was the 21st and final time the Kentucky Derby was contested over a mile and a half. Byron would be both the horse's trainer and owner, and those who rode Halma were 2 of the youngest jockeys to ever win the first Saturday in May. First, it was Lonnie Clayton, who rode Azra in 1892, but by Derby Day, his new regular rider was James Soup Perkins, no older than 16, and ready to guide the Black Stallion. They had already teamed up to win the Phoenix Stakes in record time 3 days earlier, and with just 3 opponents, Halma won by 5 lengths, one of the easiest Derby wins ever seen. It was one of many successes for Soup, who was the best jockey of 1895, with a record 192 victories, but just like most young African-American stars of the era, he was pushed out just as quickly due to racism and battling weight. He turned to training and timing in places where he could find work, but passed away due to a heart attack at just 32 years old, likely in part due to the unhealthy diets needed to stay so light. Halma would continue his career and take the equally valuable Latonia Derby and Clark Handicap, but an injury sidelined him and he was never the same athlete. A good but abbreviated career. But at stud, he would stand in both America and be exported to France. His greatest achievement being the first Derby winner to then sire a Derby winner of his own, in Alan Adale. Donau. 111. That is the most starts from a Kentucky Derby winner, something never to be duplicated. Even more outrageously, Donau passed away at just 6 years old, an unfairly brief life for a warrior horse. To only make things more insane, 41 of those races were at just 2 years old, enough to give any racing fan today a stroke. The one year where he ran less than 30 times was in his 3-year-old season, with his defining moment being in the Derby, where he was the favorite, and he lived up to the role, but won the race in close quarters, when his 3-length lead was shortened to just half a length by Joe Morris, but he still came out on top. He raced for just 2 more years, all 111 outs in the span of just 4 seasons of racing, and he would have somehow ran even more if it weren't for his legendarily bad temper. At his best, the horse was described as a veritable bulldog, and used those qualities to gamely win races, and run all day. He was one of the soundest horses to ever live, but getting him to run was frequently almost impossible. After the Derby, his temper just got worse and worse, and they tried everything to tame him, including gelding him. He fought every step of the way when he didn't want to do something. Even just saddling him was a chore. He would throw riders, plant his legs in the dirt and not move when races started. Or one time, after throwing his rider, he proceeded to lay down on the track. Not even being mercilessly beaten by whips caused him to rise. The barbaric things people tried to do at the time to get him to race were likely obscene, and there's a good chance we don't know everything they tried. But somehow, thanks to a long whip, at ages 4 and 5, they got the angry horse to race 60 more times, and retired ready for a second career. By retirement, he had won 30 times from those 111 starts, an amazing stat considering his disdain at every turn. Steeplechasing was supposed to be his next job at age 6, but before he had the chance, he passed away during a viral outbreak. A bitter end to a horse who had seen the best and worst in horse racing, taking its biggest prizes, racing endlessly without fatigue, while also spreading nothing but chaos through his antics and facing untold abuse. He could run forever, but would prefer to throw you off and sit down. Donau was a horse who deserved a lot better, and likely could have gone on to do many things in the right hands, but we'll simply never know what that would have entailed. Typhoon II. It's appropriate that this Derby was muddy. It poured the day before, and didn't have enough time to dry, leading to a messy and uneven track surface. The inside was deeper than the outside, a critical factor on race day. The heavy favorite was Ornament. He was the best horse that year. 20 wins from 32 starts when his career was set and done. No doubt, a great equine athlete. But he would lose thanks to a couple key choices. Lonnie Clayton took Ornament to the rail and started at the back, while Typhoon II and Fred Button's Garner were hustled to the lead and went wide into the first turn. Typhoon II would cover more ground, but it was made up for with better footing on that part of the track. Ornament played catch-up the whole race to Typhoon II. They separated themselves by a large margin to the rest of the field, 20 lengths to the nearest horse. Typhoon II stayed wide, being only hand-ridden, while Ornament trudged on the rail under steady whipping. Ornament gave it his all, but Garner and Typhoon II held him at bay to win by a neck, giving Tennessee a third and final Kentucky Derby. Typhoon II was a good horse, with 16 wins over his first 2 years, but Ornament proved superior, getting his revenge later that year. After his 3-year-old year, Typhoon tailed off. Despite winning at least one race at a back-breaking 145 pounds, it wasn't enough to save his stud value, and he was gelded, and failed to return to the races despite attempts. He lived out the rest of his days as a cart horse. Some say it was milk, others hay. Whatever it was a vastly different life than the days where he beat the Horse of the Year and carried a garland of roses on his back. Chant. The foundation of horse racing was 2 men getting into a disagreement over which had the faster horse. A shade of that returned when Eugene Lay offered Chant to Charles Hughes. But Charles thought he already had the Derby winner in his barn, Pearl Song. He was so sure of it that he bet $500 that Pearl Song would beat Chant. That was $500 he would never get back. With Frank Goodale aboard, Chant made it an easy win. Under hard restraint, he won by 6 lengths, with some reports even claiming up to 10 lengths, which, if true, would be a record, vindicating his father, the 1879 runner-up, Falsetto. The story after this takes a hard turn to catastrophe. Just 4 days after winning, jockey Goodale was riding at Churchill again, when his horse, Judge Payne, stumbled and fell on top of Frank, killing him. A brutal reminder of the risk every jockey accepts whenever they ride. As for Chant, he ran arduously. He had already run 25 times as a 2-year-old, taking 8 wins, and the ante was only upped when he competed in his 3-year-old year, with 33 starts. He managed a solid strike rate with 13 wins, including the Clark, but it was simply too much. And he cracked as a 4-year-old, and was never the same, racing 5 times over 2 years. He was a failure at stud, but will always be a tough racehorse. Plaudit. Ben Brush was one of the best horses of the 19th century, and his 4-year-old season was considered the greatest of all. He had beaten champions like Ornament, Hall of Famer Clifford, and Belmont Stakes winner Hastings, who became the grandsire of Man o' War. But in his final race, he would lose to an unlikely adversary, Hastings' little half-brother Plaudit, just 2 years old, and not very eye-catching. He would face Ben Brush. He carried 126 pounds, and Plaudit carried a featherweight 90, but Plaudit unexpectedly took the lead, and when they hit the wire, he had just held off the 96 Derby winner by a nose in his final start of his best season. Plaudit was 40-1. Both horses had started from the same trainer, Ed Brown, before they got sold. There was one other connection too, their rider. Willie Sims guided Ben Brush to Derby glory, and now sat on the back of Plaudit. This time, the little horse would have to play catch-up against the favorite, Lieber Karl. But Plaudit accepted his new role, and Sims knew that Lieber Karl was tired in the final eighth of a mile. He ran them down. Again by a slim margin, Plaudit was the winner, giving Sims a second Derby to new owner John Madden, who had bred 5 Derby winners, but only owned one, and it was a horse he didn't breed. A month later, Willie Sims would make history again, when he rode Sly Fox to win a race in New York, called the Preakness Stakes. Not recognizable as the Maryland staple we have today, but that win made him the only African-American jockey to win all 3 jewels of the Triple Crown, having already won 2 back-to-back Belmonts with Comanche and Henry of Navarre in 1893 and 94. Plaudit rattled 4 straight wins, including a second win over Lieber Karl in the Clark, but was injured at the end of the year, just after being sold for $25,000. With his head low, Madam bought him back for $12,000, and Plaudit became a modest sire, producing dominant handicap horse King James, but nothing like the stud power of his big brother Hastings. In a unique twist, one of Plaudit's best contributions was to the quarter horse world, with a grandson who was also named Plaudit. This quarter horse Plaudit was considered an influential sire and got himself and his sons and daughters inducted into the American Quarter Horse Hall of Fame, a stud influence you don't hear every day from a winner of the Kentucky Derby. Manuel. The end of the 19th century was not a good time for Churchill Downs. The field had just 5 horses, and 2 weeks before the race, its creator, Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., had committed suicide. He wouldn't see his track come back in the next century. There wasn't just one factor that led to this decision, but several, including financial difficulties for both himself and the facility, and declining health. This mournful derby was a 2-horse race. Manuel and California Derby winner Corsini, but Manuel was still much the best. He'd won 3 of 17 outs at 2, but when it was time for his 3-year-old year, everything went wrong. In his second start, he lost his rider and hit a fence, and then after that scare, he stepped on a nail. But somehow he recovered. His one blessing was in the Derby, where after getting a brief challenge from Corsini, he beat them by 2 lengths without full encouragement. But his luck ended after that. He stepped in a hole, which took him out of training for months, and he only had one more underwhelming start afterward. He was then put out to stud, but mysteriously died at just 4 years old, with no cause of death mentioned. Lieutenant Gibson. The first winner of the new century was a rising star that never reached his full potential. His story started right when Manuel was winning his Derby, when Lieutenant Gibson won a half-mile maiden race in the undercard, leading to a $9,500 purchase by Charles Hughes, the man that turned down Derby winner Chant in 1894. His 2-year-old year was productive, with 18 outs and multiple stakes victories, earning him a break before the Derby. The Run for the Roses was his seasonal debut. Already, $20,000 offers were being given to Charles, and just like with 1894, he turned them down, once again believing he had the Derby winner in his barn already. This time, however, he was right. Against a tough field, Lieutenant Gibson stepped up and won by 4 lengths, verifying Hughes' good judgment and propelling him into a brief winning streak, which included other classic 3-year-old races of the era, like the Clark Stakes and the Latonia Derby, which he did in a walkover because no one wanted to take him on. But it all came down in the American Derby, when he bowed a tendon, finishing 3rd. Many attempts to treat it were made, including pin firing, but it just got worse and worse, until he passed away. His owner Charles Smith was so upset over what occurred that he buried the body without telling anyone for a week before it was reported. His Eminence. 3 times, the race called the first Saturday in May did not occur in that month. Authentic in September due to COVID, Hoop Jr. in June due to World War II, but the very first had no major reason. On the last Monday in April, the 1901 Kentucky Derby was run, the earliest Derby ever. Most of the attention was on the well-regarded Tennessee bred named Allard Scheck, but it wasn't to be his day. Instead, second choice His Eminence, under Jimmy Winkfield, took the race. At 2, His Eminence had ran in the Chicago circuit, where Jimmy had guided him to his first of 11 wins. But in the Derby, he hadn't raced at 3 years old, or even gone further than a mile, making it even more impressive that he managed to adjust so well. Injury plagued him the rest of the year, but he did continue to win into his 5-year-old season. His next career was supposed to be steeplechasing, but he fell during a race and had to be put down, an untimely end. But not the end of his legacy. More than 100 years later, a Gallapalooza statue was bought for charity by an Indiana real estate agent named Pat Harrison, and stood right outside her office, greeting visitors. But mysteriously, in 2017, over a decade after the purchase, it was stolen, and never seen again. Luckily, she was able to find a replica on Craigslist, and placed it where the original fiberglass statue stood. When asked about the statue, she said, quote, "I think anybody that goes down Charleston Road that sees the horse enjoys and smiles, because he's a happy horse." Agile. Today, 20 horses thundering down a track is one of the unique features of the Kentucky Derby. No other American horse race has as many horses running at the same time. But 120 years ago, just 3 horses showed up, tied with Azra's 1892 Kentucky Derby for the smallest field in its history. Thanks to a muddy deep track, the original field of 5 was reduced, and lucky for Agile, he was a mutta, although I don't know if his mother was a mutta. His easy Derby victory was one of a handful of big stakes wins for him, that included the Tennessee Derby and the Advanced Stakes over the great mare Beldame, just the 3rd mare in history to break 6 figures, and still remembered today through the Beldame Stakes. But he was not the best 3-year-old that year, being heavily outclassed by the short-lived but almost unbeatable Sinzabi, a horse whose only loss in 15 starts came after his groom was bribed to tranquilize him. Agile moseyed down the ranks until he was last in a claiming race 2 years later in his 66th and final start. After this, he went down to Texas and had a few foals, and then lived out the rest of his days as a carriage horse. Judge Himes. Taking the bronze medal for the most starts for a Derby winner is Old Giraffe, a long-necked thoroughbred who was hardy but only had a brief period in the spotlight during a 104-race career. First, the Kentucky Derby, a race his connections didn't even think he'd win, and put him in at the last minute. It was just a year after Colonel Matt Winn took over, and started a newfound upward trajectory. Just 6 horses ran, but that didn't stop the race from being exciting. Woodlake and Bad News led for the first 3/4, but then came the poetically named Early, under Jimmy Winkfield, who looked to have the race wrapped with a precocious move. But with all his energy saved under Hal Booker, Judge Himes ran him down with a great burst of speed, to win by 3/4 of a length. Soon after the Derby, he would spring another upset, this time at 20-1 in the Hawthorne Handicap, helping his owner, C.R. Ellison, win a rumored $12,000. But it crashed after the, at the time, even larger and prestigious American Derby, with nearly 4 times as many people in attendance. Judge Himes finished last by 40 lengths to a long shot named the Picket, who had never won a race, and took the lead to win by 6 lengths over 18 other opponents. His loss in the American Derby, while also shocking, also helped get a criminal locked up. Henry Budget would be arrested for cashing worthless checks on that race. After this loss, Judge Himes continued to race, with an average of 30 races a season from ages 3 to 5, amassing 18 lifetime wins in multiple stakes from 1 1/8 to 2 miles in length, garnering a reputation as a hard-working horse, but not the best around, and one that loved the mud, likely due to having sore heels. When he retired from racing, he sired a few crossbred horses, but after 1908, his whereabouts are unknown. He simply faded from people's memories. Elwood. A winner can come from anywhere, and be created by anyone. Emma Hold Prather would become the first woman to breed a Derby winner on her farm in Missouri, one of the most remote and unique places for a winner to come from. Elwood was then bought by Charles Boots Elwood Durnell, who gifted the horse to his wife, Laska Durnell. While the namesake Elwood didn't think much of him, leaving for Chicago before the Derby because of a disappointing workout, his wife Laska had more faith, and ran her horse as the longest shot on the board of a 5-horse field. He wasn't highly liked, jeeringly called the Missouri Mule, as he was running in claiming races as low as $300 in California prior to his big date. The Derby initially proved those doubters right, as he trailed, but it was just to save his energy. He was released in the last quarter, providing one of the most thrilling finishes at the time, when he fought tooth and nail with the better-liked Ed Tierney to win by half a length. The win was one of the greatest and emotional days in Laska's life, turning her and breeder Emma Prather into history makers, thanks to their Missouri colt. Soon after, Elwood pulled double in the Latonia Derby, but tailed off, falling into claiming rankings again. After a long and uneventful rest of his career, his last reports were in California where he started racing, now as a riding horse, a quiet and open ending to Missouri's only Kentucky Derby winner. The Mule turned champion. Pink Star. A strong contender for the worst Kentucky Derby winner. Pink Star forever holds the record for the lowest career earnings of a Derby winner, with just $5,750. 84% came from his win in the Kentucky Derby. From his 15 other starts, he won just 2, and couldn't even scrape up $1,000. He was the longest shot in his Derby, at 15-1, doubted by all, including his owner, but he had the mud on his side. The field was reduced to 6, and those who were left didn't like the surface. Except for Pink Star. The 16.5-hand ill-tempered horse with a huge blaze and 4 white stockings pulled off the upset. But only a year after his triumph, he was a simple farm horse, and a gelding, described by some newspapers as disgraced. While mostly a failure, and called a mean critter, just like his father, he is forever the winner of the Kentucky Derby, even if the rest of the world put him to the wayside. When it was Derby day, even an otherwise ordinary horse like Pink Star could live up to his name. Sir Huon. Named after a knight in the European romance opera Oberon, the horse Sir Huon was Kentucky through and through. He was bred in Louisville itself by George Long of Bashford Manor Stables. He was the end of 2 Kentucky Derby trilogies. First, George Long, who had already bred Azra and Manuel. Then, for his sire, Falsetto, who produced Chant and his Eminence. Sir Huon's participation would be bittersweet, as Falsetto had passed away when Sir Huon was only a yearling. He'd run posthumously for one of the Derby's greatest sires. He had the love of all the locals. He was one of them, born and raised in Falls City. The cheers never stopped after he entered the paddock. His main adversary was the filly Lady Navarre from one state over, winner of both the Tennessee Oaks and Derby. After starting the race sideways, Sir Huon quickly recovered and overtook Hyperion II after a fast pace. He then trudged home to hold on by 2 lengths over Lady Navarre, who ran credibly to be second. A rematch would come only a month later in the Latonia Derby. It was a match race, and not much of one either, as Sir Huon won by 5 lengths eased up. He won from Cincinnati to Coney Island at age 3, but slowed down when he became an older horse. 10 wins from 18 outs by the time he retired. He proved unsuccessful at stud, and concluded his stud life siring Army remount horses. Stonestreet. 1908 was a bad year for horse racing. A push for anti-gambling laws grew, causing many track closures, the biggest being in New York, where the Hart-Agnew Law passed, an anti-gambling law that led to the temporary shutdown of all racing in the state, taking with it some of New York's most iconic tracks of the time. Louisville would also be hit with anti-gambling laws, specifically ones that outlawed the use of bookmakers, at the time the go-to betting for the Kentucky Derby. No longer could people get curated odds chosen by the bookies, but Matt Wynne found a loophole. Back in 1878, they had tried to introduce a French form of betting known as parimutuel wagering, something that any person who bets on horses should be familiar with. But at the time, it wasn't a success. This time, however, 30 years later, it would become the default way to bet all the way to the present day. All the money bet on a race being used to calculate the odds and payoffs of each horse. For our 1908 winner Stonestreet, the money was not on his nose. He was 23-1, the second longest shot, a seemingly dismal horse dismissed even by his own owners. But like Pink Star the year before, he was saved by a deluge of rain. As the rest of the field struggled through the deep sludge, Stonestreet was on easy street, winning by 3 lengths, but stopping the time in an abysmal 2 minutes 15 and a fifth seconds, the slowest Derby time for a mile and a quarter ever. Almost 16 seconds slower than Secretariat, and 2.5 seconds slower than the second slowest time done by Pink Star. It was the only stakes win in Stonestreet's 92 race career, but it wasn't a career without value or talent, as he managed 18 lifetime wins, a hard-working blue-collar horse, once winning a race after being 100 meters behind his opponents in the first half mile. By the time he was 6, he even had a sudden burst of improvement, winning 8 times in 20 outs, nearly doubling his lifetime wins. But as a 9-year-old, he suffered an untimely end after escaping his paddock and severely cutting himself on a wire fence, a tragedy especially to those closest to him, as he had become a sentimental favorite of theirs. Wintergreen. One state over from Kentucky, only one has bared the roses, representing Ohio. That was Wintergreen, born in Woodlawn near Cincinnati, bred by the mighty Jerome Respes, a man with quite a history. In the last decade of the 19th century, he had gotten into plenty of trouble, mainly in bar fights, including one altercation where he was shot in the arm. He then turned his career towards the sketchy and tumultuous life of a bookmaker to fund his new breeding and racing operation. Despite police raids and court cases, by the 1900s, he had his greatest horse yet, in Dick Wells, named for the father of the legendary Orson Welles, a record setter and one of the best ever seen when he retired, and Wintergreen's sire. One look was all that was needed for those close to Wintergreen to be sure that he would beat the 9 other horses in the 1909 Derby. The race started a half an hour late, but Wintergreen was perfect, leading at every pole and only getting further away to win by a confident 4 lengths, an above-average win margin. He'd placed in stakes races later in his career, but never won another stakes race after the Derby, with his ankle being a common problem he had to deal with. He accrued 16 wins from 61 outs. By the time he was 8, he had been gelded and no longer under Jerome's care when a fire broke out at a stable at Latonia Racetrack. The blaze killed him and 7 other horses. His life started and ended in Cincinnati, going from one side of it to the other. Meridian. In 1911, the Hart-Agnew Law took effect, stopping New York and New Jersey racing in its tracks. Not even the Belmont Stakes was run in 1911 or 1912. With this, New York owners and trainers who had boycotted the Derby before, starting after 1886 with Ben Ali, finally came back west, including Meridian, with New York owner Richard Carman. Meridian had failed to reach his reserve price as a 2-year-old, but Carman acquired him when he was 3 and sent him west. Just 3 days before the Derby, he ran in a newly inaugurated race called the Bluegrass Stakes, today one of the most important preps for the Run for the Roses. All the way back to its first renewal, it created a Derby winner, but most backed the wrong horse from that race. The gelding Governor Gray won the Bluegrass, and Meridian was second. Round 2 came fast, and this time Meridian wasted no time, setting a torrid pace, opening up 4 lengths, but things got close in the stretch when he began to tire. An ill-timed ride on Governor Gray and a late swerve by Meridian helped him hang on, setting a record time of 2 minutes 5 seconds, more than a second faster than Lieutenant Gibson from 11 years ago. The race wasn't without controversy, as the owner of Governor Gray, James Williams, thought a bookie named Charlie Ellison, who backed Meridian, and Governor Gray's jockey Roscoe Troxler were in cahoots, after catching him paying the jockey a piece of his winnings. Although the bookie later claimed it was travel money so Troxler and his wife could leave Louisville. Williams proceeded to swing his cane twice at the bookie over the next 4 days, and never fully believed him. Meridian would continue a successful 3-year-old season, being considered the best horse of 1911, setting a track record in Canada the same year. His highest praises came at 3, but he won even more at 4, with 8 more wins, and at 5, despite slowing down, he managed to set a track record in the Excelsior Handicap. He retired with 20 wins from 66 starts, and 45 finishes in the top 3. In retirement, he was a modest stud, starting at Richard Carman's stud farm before it was burned down in a suspected arson, killing 25 of his horses. Meridian, miraculously, was in a different barn, and lived, going to William Garth later on, where he lived one of the longest lives for a Derby winner of the time, passing at the age of 27. Worth. 30,000 was how much Worth was worth by the end of his brief career. He only raced for a year and a half, winning 15 of 31 races, most in his 2-year-old season, which built him up as the heavy favorite for the Derby. Before he had run his biggest race, he had already sold successfully for $10,000 as a juvenile and earned more money than Meridian. He lived up to expectations when it was time for the Roses, aggressively taking the lead. Only one scare would come as they trudged through the mud when a long shot named Duval flew late to try and run him down. While the margin was only a neck, Worth only needed hand riding to hold off Duval. He stayed a good stakes performer that year, but wasn't nearly as authoritative, winning 5 of 18 outs with 6 seconds and 3/3. But it then all came to an end after his jockey put him too close to another horse. The two fell and took a third horse with them. Worth initially survived, but had severed 2 tendons in the right hind. He later died of blood poisoning, ending what was a promising career and life. George Smith. In 1918, in Maryland, a great race occurred. The Bowie Handicap had the last 3 winners of the Kentucky Derby all in one race. That year's winner Exterminator, the previous year's Omar Khayyyam, and the oldest was the 1916 winner George Smith, carrying top weight of 130 pounds, 10 more than Exterminator and 15 more than Omar Khayyyam. A powerhouse older horse who had been great since the beginning. At 2, he was a success in 2 countries, winning 2 stakes in America and 3 in Canada. A great record, but not enough to hog the limelight. Bettors also loved the very crudely named The Cock and British-bred Starhawk, who had been brought to the US as a baby, determined to become the first horse not born in the US to take the Roses. It came down to those 2 when the race reached its closing stages. Johnny Loftus saved up George Smith while he led the pack, opening up a comfortable lead, while Starhawk flew from the back. Starhawk gained ground with every stride, while George Smith used all his reserves. When they hit the wire, the black colt George Smith had won by a neck, denying England its first Derby champion. It was the only win for George Smith that year, but as he got older, he got stronger, having his highest earning season at age 5, bringing us back to that Triple Derby winner face-off. In a loaded 15-horse field that included other champions, like Preakness winner Warcloud, the 3 Derby winners were 6 lengths ahead of the nearest horse as they smashed the mile-and-a-half track record. But there only could be one winner, and leading the pack, fighting off an English-born American-raced horse, just like in his most iconic win, was George Smith, defeating Omar Khayyyam and Exterminator, a final victory for a great horse. 17 wins from 31 starts. After this, he was a modest stud, later becoming an Army remount stallion in New York, living to be 20 years old. Omar Khayyyam. Only 1 year after Starhawk failed to beat George Smith in Louisville, and a year before George Smith would beat him, Omar Khayyyam was a history maker. He may have raced his entire career in America, but he was born in England. Conflicts in both America and Britain led to more trade of horses during the later 1910s, anti-gambling laws in New Jersey and New York, while Britain was in the midst of the Great War, later known as World War I. American horses raced in Britain, and British-born horses came to America, such as the previous Starhawk, and Omar Khayyyam was short after, being bought for 300 guineas to be trained by Charles Patterson. A bright chestnut colt, considered talented from the word go. He was a 13-to-1 outsider, winning just once in 6 starts before his date with the Derby. But confidence from his trainer hadn't waned. He had more faith in Omar than any other Derby prospect in his past, and that included Ornament, who he had trained 20 years earlier. This race would introduce Omar Khayyyam to a valuable piece of equipment: blinkers, with huge cups covering more than half his vision, but never his huge blaze, forcing him to look straight. It was a particularly patriotic derby, run 1 month after the US had joined World War I, which would add a unique flavor to this win. Just 7 minutes after the Preakness was run, the derby was off. After initial traffic issues shuffled him to 10th, Omar Khayyyam found his way through, the blinkers helping him harness his speed as he surged past horses late. In just a few strides, he was able to open up 2 lengths to win the derby over the favorite Ticket, who had beaten him just 4 days ago in the Derby trial. Omar Khayyyam was the first non-American horse to win the Kentucky Derby. Soon after, due to World War I, Omar was sold again, this time for a staggering $26,000. Still nothing compared to the $49,000 he earned as a 3-year-old, stacking up 9 wins in the biggest races in America, like the Saratoga Cup, Travers Stakes, Brooklyn Derby, and Lawrence Realization. The last 2 were against Hourless, another British-born horse who that year had taken the Belmont Stakes. 1917's 2 best American 3-year-olds were two British colts. The debate on the two was divisive. Omar Khayyyam had won 2 of their 3 meetings, but Aurelius had won the American Championship over him, considered the best race of the year. Regardless, by the end of 1917, they were both considered some of the best to ever race. But heavyweights would catch up to Omar Khayyyam as a 4 and 5-year-old, causing a dramatic drop in quality as he struggled to win 3 of his last 14 races, including finishing behind 3 different Kentucky Derby winners, finishing behind Old Rosebud and Regret in the Brooklyn Handicap, and then George Smith in the previously mentioned Bowie Handicap, although he did finish ahead of Exterminator. He sired many horses, but was only a modest success, living to be 24, and for 41 years, the Kentucky Derby's only non-American victor. Behave yourself. When you win the Kentucky Derby, most would consider that one of the greatest moments of your life. Now imagine winning your first Kentucky Derby, and still finding a way to be disappointed. Colonel E.R. Bradley had 2 horses entered. One was the fan's choice, Black Servant, and the other was the less regarded colt, Behave Yourself. The stable workers had put all their money on Black. Newspapers at the time estimating that they stood to win $500,000 if Black Servant won. While Bradley was alleged to have taken part in the betting, this has been disputed. Whether he did or not, he likely would have preferred to have Black Servant win because he was out of his own personal stallion, Black Tony. Also in the field was the filly Prudery, who had beaten boys at 2, coupled with her stablemate, Trister. Black Servant would take the lead from the start, leading as they charged past the stands the first time. When he hit the wire the second time, he was 6 lengths ahead of Prudery. It could have been a blowout win, but by that time, his stablemate had joined him. Who was the winner is all but given away, but how it happened has a tall but hard to verify tale. As Charles Thompson urged Behave Yourself, trying to win, Lawrence Like on Black Servant yelled at him, "Take back, you son of a bitch!" Then supposedly, a hat from a spectator blew onto the track, stopping Black Servant for just a moment as the two were locked in battle. This gave Behave Yourself the perfect time to eke forward and prevail, snubbing his stable of $500,000 by winning them a $50,000 race. It was the 4th and final win for the unruly Behave Yourself, becoming a polo sire and then a remount sire. In 5 meetings, Black Servant beat Behave Yourself in 4 of them, but the only time he didn't is the one that people will remember. Whiskery. 3 years after she faltered in the Kentucky Derby, Prudery gave birth to a brown colt set to avenge her. Bred and owned by Harry Payne Whitney, who had the same roles with 1915 winner Regret, Whiskery wasn't as flashy as she was, but would achieve the same goal. His first 2 seasons were nearly identical, 18 outs, 6 wins, although the big difference was that at 3 years old, he earned almost $95,000. He was the coupled favorite, but his stablemate Bostonian was preferred, having won the Preakness Stakes 5 days earlier, but took a backseat this race. The early fractions were carved on the muddy track by Jock and Osmond, but Whiskery's opportunity arose in the stretch, as Earl Sandy on Osmond wrapped his leg around Chick Lang on Jock, pinning him on the rail. Whiskery on the outside would take advantage of the heated duel, and was ready to run by both of them. But Sandy noticed. Unlatching from Jock, he redirected his horse and slammed Osmond right into Whiskery late. But despite doing everything he could, Whiskery won by a nose, giving Whitney another derby. It was the peak of Whiskery's long career. He was bought for stud duty for a large sum of $60,000 by some of racing's elites, Charles Stone, Bull Hancock, and William Woodward, and turned up empty, sterile, unable to produce. He was brought back to the races, and was a shell of his former self, winning 2 of his next 33 races. Finally, Stone bought out his other sharers to retire him as a riding horse in his stud in Virginia. He lived there for 5 years, but died after a paddock accident. But that wasn't the end of the bloodline. Only a year after Whiskery had won the Derby, his full brother Victorian won the 1928 Preakness and went on to take the $100,000 1930 Agua Caliente Handicap in Tijuana, Mexico, continuing his mother's legacy. The most recent pair of full siblings to take Triple Crown races are Mage, the 2023 Derby winner, and Dornick, the 2024 Belmont Stakes winner. But the first Triple Crown brothership was Whiskery and Victorian. Middleground. Right in the middle of the century came Texas's second Kentucky Derby winner, hot off the heels of the Triple Crown winner Assault. Born in the exact same place, King's Ranch, with the same sire Bold Venture, Middleground would take after his dad and win 2 jewels of the Triple Crown. Who would guide King Ranch's next star horse? Why, another Texan, of course, in Bill Boland, a 16-year-old apprentice with one of the craziest meteoric rises of any jockey. On April 29, 1950, he won his first ever stakes race in the Gallant Fox Handicap on a horse named Better Self, a great achievement for a young rider to win a $50,000 horse race. Not even a week later, he then rode Ari's Mona to win in the Kentucky Oaks, and as if that wasn't already crazy enough, exactly a week after winning his first stakes race, he was riding in the Kentucky Derby against 2 Triple Crown winning jockeys. Johnny Longden rode the favorite Your Host, the future sire of the greatest gelding of all time, Kelso, and the master Eddie Arcaro rode second choice Hill Prince, donning the checkered silks of Meadow Stud. A huge challenge for a young man to take on. Your Host would not show up that day, but as they rounded the turn, 4 horses were separated by less than 2 lengths, but it would be Middleground who broke away. Hill Prince could only get second. Not even the great Eddie Arcaro could catch Boland, as Boland became the second apprentice to win the Kentucky Derby. Who was the first? Ira Hanford, on Middleground's father, Bold Venture. The win was Texas in every corner. A Texas jockey rode a Texas-born and owned horse, trained by a Texas trainer in Max Hirsch. A bad trip in the Preakness gave Hill Prince the chance to reverse their order, but in the Belmont, it was back to Texas, as Middleground ran down lights up to win the Test of Champions by a length. Bill Boland may not have been allowed to vote, enlist in the army, or drink yet, but he had already won 2 jewels of the Triple Crown. Middleground's soundness proved troublesome and abridged his career. He failed to produce at stud, but lived happily at King's Ranch until he passed away at 25. Boland would ride for another 19 years, winning many important races, including another Belmont Stakes on Amberoid in 1966. He would then transition to being a trainer, where poetically, his only stakes win was when Weiss Phillip won the Gallant Fox Handicap, making the Gallant Fox Handicap the first and last stakes win he would ever win. Flying Ebony. Today, we can watch the Derby from practically anywhere. I watched the 150th Derby at an Italian restaurant, but in 1925, broadcasting was in its infancy, and for the first time ever, the Kentucky Derby would be heard on the radio. Over 6 million people would listen as an upset would emerge. Flying Ebony was born where champions come from, and ridden by one of the best jockeys of the era, but was somehow still a long shot. He was a mix of prestige and doubt, born at Hamburg Place Farm, where greats like Old Rosebud, Sir Barton, and Zev also took their first steps, sold for a high price as a youngster of $21,000, and winning 4 straight at 2 years old, including winning on the undercard of the 1924 Derby, when only hours later, Black Gold would take the 50th Derby. But he had never won a stakes race, and that win streak seemed behind him. His jockey also seemed to have his best moments in the rearview mirror. Earl Sandy. He had ridden Zev, and later in his career would ride Gallant Fox, but between that and 1925, he was recovering from a grievous fall, and getting mounts after his injury was difficult. Flying Ebony was not his first choice to ride, but it was the only one he had. But luck was on their side, as a deluge came down just before the race. Flying Ebony liked the mud, and was the only horse wearing the proper shoes. As other horses slipped and slided, Sandy rode perfectly in the mud on his black horse, only ever letting Captain Hal head them at any point in the race, and then retaking their lead in the stretch. It was also the first time the term Run for the Roses had been used to describe the Kentucky Derby, which has stuck 100 years on. Flying Ebony never won another race, and was unsuccessful at stud. His final owner was Charles Perkins, and when Perkins passed away, he had written a letter asking for Flying Ebony to be euthanized if he were to die, as he didn't believe that anyone else could take care of the aging horse. So soon after Perkins passed, so did Flying Ebony, at 21 years of age. Bubbling Over. Brilliant, but fleeting. The Kentucky Derby was the final stop in a 13-race career for Bubbling Over, but first, we go to the start. The day he ran his first race. Colonel E.R. Bradley was singing the blues in 1925. It was a disappointing season, and on this day his first 3 horses had all failed to win. All that was left was a green 50-1 shot, who was considered not a good looker with a wide body. But as they hit the wire, it was he who was first. 3 days later, he won again. And 8 more days later, he won for a third time. By the end of 1925, Bubbling Over had won 7 of 10 races, and tussled with the best of his crop, like Mars and Display, but one was missing. Bubbling Over was an aggressive frontrunner who was hard to catch. This boomer bust style wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity, because of one problem that would go on to end his career. He was going blind. This first revealed itself in his 6th start and first defeat, when Earl Sandy whipped him to get him around a wet spot on the track. Bubbling Over didn't see it, and in response, bolted to the far outside. Still, he was able to finish 3rd, his worst finish in his entire career. If he was behind horses, the kickback and commotion would disorient him. He needed the lead and the inside rail as a guide around the track. Still, he was so talented that he was the favorite for the 1926 Derby, where he would finally face the one star of his crop he hadn't faced at 2, Pompey. Pompey had also won 7 of 10 races, and his owners were confident that he was the best around. Bradley, always a betting man, put a $120,000 wager that Bubbling Over would finish ahead of Pompey, and also bet heavily in other places. When the race began, it was just like how Bubbling Over had handled his 9 other wins. He went to the lead and never looked back. Even with his ailing vision, Pompey couldn't keep up with him, and was stuck in 2nd place and faded back to 5th. A 10th and crowning victory for Bubbling Over. While he could no longer race due to his vision and a problem in his tendons, he could still produce, creating his own Derby and Preakness winner, Burgoo King. And as a dam sire, his daughters birthed Horse of the Year and Hall of Fame inductees, Busher and Hill Prince. A great racing talent able to carry on through his kin. Paul Jones. 17 horses lined up for the 1920 renewal, all except for one. Man o' War. The greatest of his time, some debate the greatest ever, did not race in the Kentucky Derby, as owner Sam Riddle didn't want to send him out west that early in the year and run him at 1.25 miles. He thought it was too much too soon. At 2, Man o' War had never ran further than 6 furlongs, so it would have been a huge leap. Instead, he waited to run in the 1 1/8 Preakness, more local to Riddle's Maryland farm. It's the only reason that he is not a Triple Crown winner. With him not in the race, a trio of Harry Payne Whitney horses took favorites, including an infamous one named Upset. Upset was the only horse to ever defeat Man o' War in his 21 starts. Thanks to Man o' War having a poor start, terrible traffic, and top weight, he just missed Upset in the Sanford Memorial. Man o' War beat Upset 6 out of 7 times, but people will only remember the one time he didn't. Way further down the field was the coupled 15-1 stablemates, Blazes and the gelding Paul Jones, with Blazes being the preferred horse, while Paul Jones was described in one newspaper as the ugly brown horse and sister of the stable. But his owners thought more favorably of him, and when the horses took off, he was first in line, setting the pace. By the 1 mile mark, his lead had reached its peak of 2 lengths, but then came the final furlong, as Upset joined alongside him, his lead now scant. Many thought Upset would be the winner, but at the most crucial moment, he tired, and Paul Jones prevailed on the inside. He had upset Upset. While easily the height of his career, and nearly half his career earnings, Paul Jones did continue to find success afterward. Later that year, he took the important Suburban Handicap, defeating Exterminator, and at 4 won the Susquehanna Handicap. But just like all others in 1920, he was no match for the Mostis horse. Man o' War trounced him in the Potomac Handicap, as he had at 2 in the Futurity, even while carrying 24 more pounds than Paul Jones. He retired at 6 with 65 outs and 14 wins, living another 7 years, doing a variety of jobs like hunting, ponying, and steeplechasing. And that, my friends, is the end of the Kentucky Derby Iceberg, but never the end of the story. Every year, there will be a new horse to win this great race, a new story to tell, a new rider to guide him, a new trainer to raise him, and one to thousands of people who can all say they owned him. All taken for a ride on a half-a-ton animal that can complete 1.25 miles in just 2 minutes. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.